Welcome to Alathian Heart Ministries. I'm Rick Friedrich. Today I want to introduce, this is an introduction to a new video series and book, and it's called How to Prove Historical Events as Real, Introduction to Belief, Disbelief, and Suspending Judgment, presenting the rules of evidence for properly evaluating the historical events of Christianity contrasted with that of modern events such as the moon landing. Featuring the works of the foremost expert on evidence, Simon Greenleaf, a treatise on the laws of evidence and the testimony of the Evangelists. Now this is very comprehensive, and I have no idea how many videos there will be. I'll try and keep them shorter. And there are many subjects involved here. This subject interests everyone, no matter what you believe, I guarantee you. And it may sound boring, but it's critical. It's critical to every judgment you make in life. So I want to tackle it, and I'm going to explain some things here. I'm going to try and remember everything I want to say in this introduction, so bear with me. So we're going to talk about Simon Greenleaf. Briefly, I'll mention who he is. So Simon Greenleaf was born in 1783 and died in 1853, and was an early professor in Harvard in those later years of his life there. So he, at that time, the Americans did not have a publication of their own on the laws of evidence. And so they were still using the British. And so he wrote the Laws of Evidence, 3-volume. And this is the legal standard, at least of the day. It's been expanded upon, of course, since then. And so this was the single greatest writing on the subject, and it is the standard. So later on in life, in 1846, he wrote this book, The Testimony of the Evangelists, which we're going to go over. And it is fascinating, and it's authoritative and conclusive. So in this, we're going to go over primarily what I want to focus on in this series is learning how to suspend your judgment, such as in this we want to look at this problem that people have, which I even noticed I had until I really focused on this right now. That we are put in this place of having to make a decision to believe something or disbelieve it. That's how it's presented. That's what's assumed. But what we're going to see in courts of law, for example, and in proper judgment, there is a place to believe, a place to disbelieve, and a place to suspend judgment. And in many cases in life, we ought to suspend judgment if we're going to be honest and accurate. And so what's happening is that is not taking place, and so we have a confusion and an immature pressure to come to a state of belief on something, like a historical matter, or disbelief in it. So I will explain some examples of that shortly. So this will be one big or two big examples of when we should believe, when we should disbelieve, and when we should suspend our judgment. And what I'm going to try and develop here is multiple reasons for suspending judgment. That's going to change the whole game for a lot of these debates, right, about historical matters, especially present historical matters. And that's going to take away the fuel of so many people. It's going to change the whole nature of the debate. And it's going to give you peace in your heart. Oh, like I've been talking about for years, the importance of understanding fallacy, especially the informal fallacies. And I've done a couple of videos showing them, explaining them. And my contention is the modern educational system does not teach you three different things that they ought to, so therefore you don't have a sound education because of the lack of the teaching of these three matters. One is logic, and then, so you have formal logic, and I would include their philosophy with that, and then informal fallacies. The informal fallacies alone would change everything for a lot of people, for everyone, pretty much. And then, thirdly, the laws of evidence. So, learning how to evaluate evidence properly. And this is, of course, what the courts are dealing with all the time, and that's why Simon Greenleaf is so important. So we're going to get into that a little bit here today. And so what I want to do is talk about all sorts of aspects of this. I've got over 100 pages in point form already on this. And what I want to do is talk about some of the reasons again, like the problems in science, general ignorance leading to mistakes, learning how to know when to believe, disbelieve, suspend judgment, and the psychological and spiritual reasons why people act the way they do towards evidence and other people. Understand the fallacy of either or, faulty dilemma, and when suspension of judgment is necessary for honesty in moral matters and wisdom in scientific matters. I want to give you two illustrative examples to focus on. And one of them is to prove that the testimony of the Gospels, which this book ended up proving, the testimony of the Gospel Evangelists are historically trustworthy and ought to be believed according to the laws of evidence. And then secondly, we want to contrast that positive testimony with a conspiracy that denied, within this presentation I'm going to do, a conspiracy that denied such and fabricated a story to try and disprove this evidence. And then you can weigh the difference between the two. Now this is critical because the difference in those positions are the difference between what Christians believe and what the Jewish people believe today. The ones that are not Christians, at least, because there are many Jewish Christians. So that is a subject of immense importance to modern Western history and numerous, almost endless subjects. But I want to contrast that analysis with, or maybe just illustrate another example more correctly, of what I call an appeal to prejudice in the claim by authoritarian organizations that people ought to believe events like the moon landing solely upon the testimony of two astronauts, absent of other evidence or cross-examination. So hear me out. I'm not talking about considering the subject of the moon landing. Don't get me wrong. Here, don't take me wrong. I'm talking about a specific authoritarian organization that is telling its people and everybody else that you must believe the testimony of two astronauts without any other evidence involved and without cross-examination of such astronauts. Now, we are going to address, I'm not going to get into that in detail in a little bit. We have many other related subjects to follow that kind of interplay with that last subject. So it's going to be a major focus more than, this testimony of Evangelists. But that will be referenced throughout that presentation. So there are many things at play here. And obviously we're going to get into the nature of conspiracy theory. Don't get upset by that subject matter because it plays into all matters of evidence. It's going to cross over into it. In fact, one of the things that I realized on that subject, just as a teaser to introduce what we'll be getting into, is that when analysis was done, when I did an analysis, and not just myself, I came to realize that over 60% of the whole entire Bible actually is about either narrative or teaching on, admonition against conspiracy. And so this is going to be a major revelation to these authoritarian organizations that basically say there's no conspiracies at all, practically. I'm exaggerating, but that's the way it's almost presented. And so, and I did a search of how the court systems avoid those terms. And there's other words used to mean exactly the same thing. So we want to get into the psychology of the crazy conspiracy theorist type of person, and also of those who think that they don't have views of conspiracies, and whatever. All those related subjects. So I want to do a comprehensive presentation here that addresses every point from kind of a new perspective, I would say, in the sense of introducing the idea of suspending judgment and how often that is necessary, to be honest. And all of a sudden it takes that burden off of your heart, like, oh, I'm being pushed into this camp or that camp, and both of them are wrong. quite often. And that's what I'm seeing here. So now, I'm going to get into the specific, and then I'll end with my explanation of what I've experienced and why I'm doing this right now. So I'm going to get into the immediate why, and then I'll go back into my history, including my grandfather's history that shaped my life in a major way, and it'll change your perspective of me, I hope, and help you to come to understand why I'm saying these things and believe what I do. And I'm here for everybody. I am not here to push a point. I'm here to create rational reasoning and set people free from themselves and from others, and to make this world a better place. So the immediate, I'm gonna quote some other things later on here, but the immediate reason for me doing this just happened, and it's kind of forced me to attend to a major problem. So I was, and I'll talk about my experience with creationism and the organization called Answers in Genesis, and other organizations that are creationist, and which I've been very supportive of and very appreciative of, and have obviously a lot of books. Several of these are from there. And I'll explain my testimony along those lines after I build up my history. But first, what I came across. So in one of my searches on different feeds, I came across one of their videos, or articles, I should say. Well, first of all, I had purchased a book from Dr. Danny Faulkner, which I mentioned in a previous video, called Falling Flat. I had some friends that believed in the flat earth, and I was just seeing what some other people, like Answers in Genesis, might have said on the subject. So I got the book, and it was generally pretty sound on the flat earth side of things, minus some tone that I wouldn't have appreciate, I guess, at times. But then it came to the subject of the moon landing. And I noticed that the argumentation lacked any, real criticisms or, evidences against, or purported evidences against the moon landing. And instead the whole focus was on some doctored, changed pictures that had been circulating around the internet. And so there was no substantial rebuttal or response to any of the major claims. And I thought, wow, what a difference between talking about the flat earth and the moon landing. One did a knockdown job. The other one, what was that? It looked totally like evasion to me. Or why bother even doing that? Like, in other words, pick the weakest arguments and knock them down. So I didn't really have great appreciation for that, and I did speak about it at the moment, and that was earlier this year. So then I was looking at some articles, for whatever reason, on Answers in Genesis, and came across this one particular one. And to my great shock and horror, like I read earlier here, that that this was being argued that Christians must believe in the man moon landing. I'm going to make a distinction there because there's a difference between a moon landing by robots, like they say they're doing on Mars, and a manned moon landing. So we're talking about manned moon landing. Totally different subjects. Keep that in mind. And I'm not taking a position for or against. What I'm going to actually do is move towards, like most people ought to suspend their judgment on the subject. And I'm going to demonstrate, absolutely prove that point in this whole series. In other words, I've already done it, but not to you. And this is going to be a very important thing, which as a Christian, we're going to look at Romans 14. So you can start to think about where I'm going with this if you're interested in following this. And I think this might get some attention, so I'm going to try and be very careful with this and present all the details to really handle this. And I wanted to show people what I'm about here and not just get into slamming something upon something. You got to accept this. It's all about, to me, for you, it's all about me wanting you to be honest to yourself and God. And that's the only one you have to be accountable to on matters like this. And that's what Romans 14 is talking about. Let no man judge you in such matters, and do not judge your brother in that way. So, contrary to that, we're going to see that in two different articles, one by Rob Webb, that's more recent and it's expanded, and then the first one from 2015 by Dr. Danny Faulkner, in which both of them are saying, never mind all the other evidence for the moon landing. There is only one thing you need, and that is to believe two Christian astronauts. And if you don't, you are a liar and a slanderer and whatever, big sinner, because you're calling them a liar. Whoa. How do you deal with that? Ooh. Like if you're a moonlander believer, like, yeah, they're all liars, right? You know, that's kind of the image of the conspiracy theorist, but is it? Aren't both sides the same in this subject? In the sense of the spirit? The banding together and let's get them? Like one of the persons was saying today, and I'll get into that in a minute, the details of what I'm referring to, but they were saying, heretic, you're a heretic. And they weren't even listening to what the other person, which was me, was saying. And so the point is, we need to get beyond that, grow up, and look at things objectively, peaceably. And I want to share with you my experience over the last 35 years in dialoguing with people and solving those problems. And like I'll jump into, when I went on the campuses for a year as an apologist, missionary, I debated on every campus at least one atheist who was well versed, and they all started mocking me at the beginning, and every one of them shook my hand at the end, and we both had a very good learning experience from each other. So that's what I'm after, for everybody to come to that place where, and that wasn't a matter of compromise, it was a meaningful experience rather than a combative thing. And it was away from other people. It was one-on-one. There was no pride there listed. So in this case, what happened was, to me, and I'll get into how I'm a creationist and how much work I've done and be involved with in a moment. Well, I might as well say some things, and then I'll get into it later in more detail. I have been greatly involved in creationism, and I even wrote a book, um, The Implausibility of Abiogenesis on the Early Earth. Now that wasn't about any kind of young Earth creationism, um, but I presented that in school, and I'll talk about the details later on that, in first year biology. And during that time, I was immersed in the subject. And later I became a publisher of a creationist book by a creationist, like a full-fledged creationist. And it doesn't matter who or what the details are, but I'm very invested in the subject, right? And I am not at all conversant with the drama of these organizations. And some of it's just coming before my eyes right now for the first time. I'm purely into the content. And a lot of the old debates, especially with Dwayne Gish, and I'm not saying I approve of everything that people have said and done, but what I'm getting at is I then saw these articles, and then I approached Answers to Genesis and called them up, and then we talked to Mark Louis, as recommended by the operator, as somebody that would be objective to hear what I have to say. Talked to him, had a great conversation. Great conversation. I then sent him an email he asked me to send. We texted a bit. I sent him knowingly my concern addressed to the two authors, Faulkner and Webb. I haven't heard back from them, it's been over a week. But what happened was, just 2 days ago, they made a video having an astronaut, one of these astronauts that they're saying that we need to believe, put on the jumpsuit and the whole bit and make a long video about how it was true and, you know, the moon landing wasn't fake. So I take it this is their response to me, because they're not responding otherwise. And I'm honored if they did it for me. Wow. And I don't want to sound sarcastic here. I'm just, I would really like a response, and I'm going to take the time here to fully lay out the subject. And I'm not going to let this go, because it's so important. It's so important to the testimony for Christians to be truly objective, to be example, and to be loving and so forth, but also for the creationist cause and the young earth creationist cause. There is no, in my view, which I'll get into, there is no reason to bring up such a subject by such an organization. In fact, what you find in the articles themselves are addressing how, in other videos, they're mentioning how the people that are coming to the Ark, they have this, I think 3 now attractions. They're like entertainment centers, in a sense, with some historical focus on the Ark and creation evidences, kind of like a family thing that you go to. And there they're saying how there's all these people who don't believe the moon landing. And so they take this very negative attitude towards these people, and almost like we don't want them around. And interesting, when they did this video, it looks like about 75% of the people coming to watch that video of theirs are not believing in the moon landing. And And I think people, I guess, don't know the difference between denying and suspending their judgment, which is what I want to try and do, which I'm trying to do there on their comments. And so what happened is they're saying that more and more people are, like, that are Christians are not believing in the moon landing. And I'm noticing, especially the younger the way people are, they are not believing that. And, you know, that doesn't prove anything. I'm not trying to say anything. Don't always look at me as trying to prove something here. I'm tabling things. And so, but what I'm thinking about is, why would you polarize people? Why would you, like, basically push them away? Why would you take a stand on that officially when it doesn't pertain to your subject matter? It just doesn't make sense. And to get people offended, to turn away people from your organization doesn't make sense. And I try to spare them that mistake, especially when you make the reasonings that they're doing right now. So that's kind of the immediate context as to why I kind of am getting forced into this to do it. Because when I went around as a missionary for a year, and numerous other examples that I'm engaged in ministry, I get these things pointed at me. Well, what about this, that, and I'm like, hey man, I agree with you. What? Yeah, you're right. And you know what? I was a skeptic too. And I was a skeptic because I was brought up in an environment that was professing Christian, but that was not genuine. And so I was offended when you have somebody who has not taken the log out of their own eye and then judges you for doing bad things. What does it do inside your heart? It doesn't encourage you to do the right thing. It makes you bitter. And that's what's happening with the young generation. People realize that. So, and I love my parents. I have the best relationship with them ever. You know, but I do have a fundamentally different understanding of what it means to be a believer in God. And that's another whole story. But, so before I just jump back into that, my testimony, I'm going to deal with the problems in science. So after I just finished this book, actually I've got another 2 more days finishing it up, which is one of our kits. And the second title is The Nature of Science in Open Context, which I did in the last video. I read from this. I'm going to expand upon that a little bit yet. But I'm going to talk about the nature of science in relation to evidence, and how so many scientists don't even know logic or the laws of evidence, and therefore are not in the right place to do science. Whoa, it's a big statement, but it's a fact. And I am a scientist. You can believe that or not, it doesn't matter. I am, in the historical sense of the term, I guess you could say, old world. And we're going to talk about the general ignorance leading to mistakes of these laws of evidence, and then learn how to know when to believe, disbelieve, and suspend judgment, as I've already said. So these are the reasons for this series, and these are some of the themes that we'll get into. Like, we'll get into the nature and scope of authority in relation to science, and numerous other issues when we're dealing with this moon landing, like transhumanism, should we have ever attempted to go to the moon, like biblically speaking, it doesn't make sense scientifically speaking because it's completely dangerous. Almost 300 people have died in the pursuit of going to space, like directly, and that's not even in space. It's not, there's no reason for going that at least is evident to me. So we want to look at that and the nature of transhumanism in relation to that. And really isn't that the same thing as Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel? And that's what, like I would have expected that from answers in Genesis. If their answers are there, why not consider that the earth is our home? The earth is the Lord's footstool, right? The earth is my footstool. We'll get into all that. I'm going to get into my story here. We're going to get into some history books here right after. And so I'm going to share with you some things that I've never shared before, which get really personal. And then maybe you'll understand a little bit more why I say the things I do and where I'm coming from, that my life has been gripped by family history, in a sense. So, I grew up in Canada half a lifetime ago, and I grew up in Toronto, Canada, the big city, the most culturally diverse place in the world. And that was a really great experience in that exposure. I got into all sorts of personal problems due to not being taught how to read. I started learning in grade 3. And I had an eye problem, especially after I got mercury fillings. And then I struggled because I couldn't read like everybody else. And so I was considered the stupid kid. And then I tried to prove myself, to make myself have some self-worth or something, in sports and all that. But I could, academically, I had no interest in the content, and it didn't work out for me, the schooling situation, early on. And of course I wasn't a Christian, but I got frustrated. I wasn't helped. There was various programs I went and attended to, whatever, sob story, Rick, ha ha, blah, 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 blah. Well, whatever. I then tried to survive, is what I did. So this made me think outside of the box, which is what I said in here, the nature of science in open systems, not closed systems. And so we're going to talk about psychologically open here and dealing with evidence in this whole presentation. But so I struggled in a home that was essentially hypocritical, in a church. I went to a Baptist church. I grew up Baptist. And there was no love there, at least towards me. And so I just learned to despise it. And to the point where even as a young child, I lied to not go to church. I didn't do this for school, to church. Because the kids mocked me because I couldn't read and I didn't know the Bible like they knew. And they were in more stable homes, apparently not. But, so I grew up I despised it. And I didn't despise God or Jesus. I kind of I wasn't closed there, but I was closed against Christianity and the people. Because everybody I knew, pretty much, was not a good example. I'm talking about like even being really converted. I did not see evidence of that, and I didn't understand that at the time. It was just something I didn't want, something I had to escape from. I was trapped, right? So I guess you could call me a survivor of that too, if you want to. And I didn't go off into the so-called liberal way of like hating people, you know, and being, I'm not saying liberals hate people, but like the mentality of being so bitter about people that, you know, you despise them. I just wanted to get away from it, right? So anyway, what happened was, I did my best. My mother forced me to go to church. My dad was an alcoholic, and I didn't, you know, as soon as I was like in grade 9, I stopped going to church altogether. And then I did what I wanted. But I used to like sneak out during the service, go to the store and stuff like that. So anyway, what happened was I ended up getting into a lot of trouble as a youth. And so I've given my testimony before along those lines. I don't need to get into it. So after 3 years of being involved in a gang, and this is all in Canada, not in the United States, I was Canadian then. And so I ended up getting in trouble, and then eventually the Lord tripped my feet up, and by His grace, I found Him. And so, but in the midst of that, before I truly found Him, I started getting serious, at least, right? But I was still, you know, a skeptic in a lot of ways. And so I did start looking at the evidences, and like this book and that. And then I had some very serious spiritual phenomena in my life happen, which is another whole story. A lot of spiritual attacks that were indescribable, I could say. And especially when I was trying to get serious. I didn't have the power. I was like what Paul talks about in Romans 7 before he got to the Romans 8 or Romans 6 experience. The good I want to do, I can't do. I just don't have this power. I didn't understand the grace of God. Anyway, that's not really the topic here, but I searched out the evidences. This really very much pertains to this theme right here, this point. And I studied, I thought I had to prove every point of the Bible true before I could believe it. That's what I was looking to do. It's like, whoa. But it was that was a lot of learning to do. It was like, and I just really didn't think about like, there's a different way. And the truth is, you just have to believe two Christians and anything is proven true, right? No. That's what these people are going to argue on that point. This is not, even though it might sound a little similar, and people might try and use this against me to say this, but after surveying so much evidence, and not just, like you have to understand historical evidence. So in other words, there was these supposed contradictions in the Bible that in times past there wasn't an answer for. So the skeptics seized upon those points and hammered them home and thought that, hey, they've disproven the Bible as some work of God. And so, but then when I looked at the history of the controversies and noticed how over centuries these difficulties were resolved. And as time went on, more and more and more. And of course, there's still some things, and these related to misunderstanding of words, mistranslation, and archaeological evidence giving context. Oh, when they said son of somebody, that could mean a grandson or a great-grandson. It's not a contradiction. Like they're trying to figure out, is Nimrod the direct son of Cush? Or, and I'm trying to make the question is he, I'm going off here on a subject, but it's very relevant later on. Nimrod was 200 years later after Babel. And so was Cush still alive, and was he still his son later on? That's another point. But so there's all these kind of subtle points that there's assumptions made, and therefore contradictions are supposed by things. And so when I started looking at that in the historical development of and resolution of those things, it's like, oh, okay. And then what was really interesting, when I saw my own kind as the skeptic, when I saw my own kind become deceitful, and particularly Voltaire. Voltaire's arguments were dishonest. And because a lot of people were ignorant and they had no real book learning or whatever, and he was the expert. Now this is a long time ago, Voltaire. But when I saw that, and I read some responses to Voltaire of people who were skeptics, just like him, and then became believers, and heard their explanation, it made a lot of sense. So I've been somebody who's done a lot of research on former skeptics who have believed. And unfortunately, and I will bring this up right now, there are skeptics turned believers that don't have the quality of the argumentation and the sincerity of their research, and they've given some legends or fables about Simon Greenleaf, for example. There's been circulating, and I looked this up extensively right now, there's no evidence for this belief, that he was a skeptic and was challenged by his students to apply the laws of evidence in his treatise to the Gospels, and therefore wrote this book. There's no evidence suggesting that happened, but actually that happened with somebody else. So that, skeptics have seized upon, that's an urban legend, and I will get into my beef with more recent apologetics. Now I'm older, so like these old books, I've got my apologetics books over there, this is just on creationism here. But, and this gets a little bit later in my testimony, and you'll hear, I'll get into that maybe later. But I wanted to touch on that. So when I'm going through this struggle and reading commentaries, and when it really bothered me when I read a commentary like Norman Geisler's, for example, answers to these Bible difficulties. And I'll explain my relationship with Geisler in a bit. But when I saw answers that were just given, just to give an answer, that turned me off. That says desperation. That's like, because you want to be the Bible answer man, right? Or whatever. And that doesn't help the skeptic. It didn't help me. It says, why are you doing that? Right? It says, you're desperate. And that's what I'm saying about answers in Genesis. When they're arguing this way, they're ruining their testimony, because it's totally inconsistent with the way they argue against evolutionists. So I'm all about being fair. I'd rather be like David and join the Philistines when Saul is all backwards and wrong, right, King Saul. I guess that's where I'm kind of becoming right now in this subject, perhaps. I don't know. Let's see what happens to me. But I have been alone for a long time. And remember this fact that we're going to bring up later on. Noah was the only righteous man in the world. The only righteous man in the world before the flood. So come to grips with that for those of you who have a beef against the theses that I'm going to be making here. So, which is really calling not for a conclusion on the matter of the moon landing for or against. It's to provide the groundwork for how to determine what decision to make. To me, the subject matter isn't important. The methodology determines your outcome. So your methodology better be sound, because your outcome will be determined by your methodology and your heart, rather than the subject matter being important in and of itself is infinitely minor compared to having a proper methodology on how to evaluate evidence. That's why this subject is so important, not about showing particular evidences for or against. We have to approach them with the right methodology. That's what I'm going to do. That's the theme here. So anyway, I started going into these evidences here, for and against and everything. And I finally opened up the Bible, like really opened up the Bible and read it. And I was amazed. I was amazed, for example, numerous verses I've never heard before. And you know, I've been forced to go to church all my life. And I was like, wow, that's a different book. I had no idea. It totally contradicts everything I grew up believing. Not everything, but in the matter of holiness, personal holiness, for example. And so that was a big thing after I became a Christian with me, because it was so absent from anything I'd ever heard. And nobody wanted to talk about it. So anyway, I finally come to this place after all this research, and I'm like, oh, come to 1 John. And it says, he who doesn't believe the testimony God has given of his Son has made him a liar. Oh, wow. And then, of course, Josh McDowell was arguing that, you know, you have to accept Jesus as liar or Lord or lunatic. And there's some substance to that. Maybe not as presented so much by Josh McDowell, but when I read that, and I just suddenly was before the throne of God, and it just gripped my heart, like, I can't disbelieve this. I have so much evidence here, and I just didn't know properly in my head the laws of evidence. But then it just hit me, it was like, I can't say this is a lie. This is actually the most incredible story and the change of the world to the present due to the influence of that book and such people, not the representatives today, which are the worst almost in history, the majority. And you can say that's a judgment. Maybe another video on that one we can talk about. But the point is, and I want to, maybe I'll just qualify that a little bit. My expertise in history as a historian, I am a historian as well, and I publish over 100 books Now, I wrote a couple of mine, but mostly republish and do documentary evidence research. And I have published some other authors too, as I mentioned, like that are living and ones who are passed away. And so I've got over 100 books, and some of them are very important history, and some of which have been deliberately changed, like revisionist history. And I did extensive research with the present publishers who changed the words back in the 40s. And so I've done a lot of truly historical work, not just, now I'm focusing more on electrodynamics and science, but I've spent a lot of times in the stacks of libraries and finding missing pieces of the puzzle, if you will, and actually contacting descendants of some of these people that were very historically really important to American history and to the church. And so during that time, well, I'll go back to my testimony in a second, but I ended up where was I running with that? Oh, yeah, I was saying that my contrast to what I had said about modern Christianity today is in contrast to my research studies, which is from the 1830s to like the 1870s in American history, in religious history, specifically in the context of the subject of sanctification and conversion and revivals. And so that's my expertise in that history. And then in the last 20 years, I've dived into the same time period and beyond in electrical history. And that's become my expertise as well. And I teach on the history of patents, and of course, alternative energy, which is what my company is about. So now, here I was, and what I was saying is that time period where we had the Second Great Awakening. And of course I also deal with the First Great Awakening. So one of my authors that I published with is Mark Olson, who's written, I have 5 volumes from him about John Wesley. And so this is a very well-written scholarly book I publish. And so that's the First Great Awakening time period, where massive changes happen, like overnight, to the culture. And most people aren't aware of the details of that anymore, so that's why I've specialized in that. And so the Second Great Awakening was even more enlightening. And we had some level of Christian purity that hadn't been seen since New Testament times, of that scale of number of people. And by the turn of, like 1900, turn of the century, things started going downhill from there and just have gotten worse until today. That's the way I see it. So I want to make that contrast. So early on, when I was starting to go to church, one day I was left taking care of my pastor, my youth pastor, the wife of the pastor was a youth pastor, taking care of their house. And there was this book, Answers to Prayer. And I picked up that book and read it, and it was like reading from the New Testament. I was like, wow, I didn't know people were still like this, because I don't know anybody like this. And I haven't heard anybody like this in a long time in history. Because it was now about 200 years ago. So like around 1820 is where this book started off. And how this person, which I publish, had these answers to prayer. But that was part of a bigger book, which I have on the shelf over there, that was 700 pages. But it was just a smaller version of it. And that changed me. That floored me. It was a wake up, like, wow, this is something. It was appealing. It was what I was looking for and what I knew deep down had to be the case, or something like that, right? And so I just devoured this, and I went and found, and I ordered the books. I bought the books in the Christian bookstores. And of course, I then led to me eventually starting a publishing company, because I was making tracts and I was showing people, handing them out, and then people were like, well, where can I get that? And so I would start photocopying. And pastors. So I had a ministry to pastors, if you can believe that. It's kind of a weird thing. And I was always evangelizing. Well, this is after I became a real Christian. And what had to happen first was I had to make restitution for all the things that I had done, which took 5 years. Not that I didn't do anything until I finished that. But I was very involved in both the church and evangelism and various ministries. So this is how my publishing company started. I didn't plan on it. It's just that people were asking for these old books and all this stuff, and where could I get them? So I just started making them. Led to research, and then all of a sudden, like, I guess I'm a historian, right? And I say, oh, well, Rick, you didn't go to the schools and this. But I was at the schools. I was with the professors. I was doing historical work, whatever. I mean, I did have some college and what have you. And that's another whole story. And people will judge me because I don't have the degrees. Fine. I don't care. But what happened was, I was deeply involved in evangelism. And so therefore apologetics, that means giving a defense of the faith. So what happened was, I was seeking out the so-called experts and reading their books. And so one of the biggest names was Norman Geisler, who's passed away now. He was one of the Scopes, like a Scopes 2 trial witness on origin science. And big name. So I was involved with, when I first met him, I had been involved with a group that was formerly Christian Research Institute with Hank Hanegraaff people. And they left for various reasons, and they were still a unit, counter-cult ministry. We had the biggest counter-cult library in the world. So we're talking about cults. I don't want to start naming them so people might get offended, who I consider a cult. It's not my objective here. But we had all the primary documents, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. We had the studies in scriptures and the whole bit, right? And I even have my own personal copies of some of those things, which I eventually burned. So we were heavily engaged in helping people out of cults. We would actually knock on Jehovah's Witnesses' doors, to their surprise. And so in 1991, when I was doing that, I went down to this kind of really interesting historic meeting in Pennsylvania, where there was 500 ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and Norman Geisler was there. So I met him for the first time, and I was like, whoa, I got to meet the big name, right? And so that started my personal dealing with Geisler. which continued in different ways later on. Then my family, my aunt and uncle who were missionaries, went to school with Rabbi Zacharias in Ontario Bible College. And they were lifelong friends. And of course, Rabbi Zacharias was one of the biggest names, student of Norman Geisler, and now has been disgraced after his death, scandals about him, which didn't surprise me for other reasons, but that's not the objective. I do want to bring that up because I went to a church with his brother-in-law, who was his partner in that ministry. I went there because of that ministry. My brother and I did, because we were heavily into apologetics. And so we had firsthand training with that organization, and I was also involved in that other group. But in that experience, I found that the scholarship wasn't very good. The research was poor. The argumentation was weak. And even though there was a lot of good things, there was more and more concern. So that's why we had to pull away from that, my brother and I and others. And so I was involved in this group, and I'm trying to build this case here for what I experienced with the creationists here to show that I have been deeply involved in apologetics and creationism during this whole time period. So what happened was I ended up working with this group, and they too were trying to beat people up and win an argument. And what happened was they would win the argument. Like, I had a guy who was kind of mentoring me in a sense, who was older and really smart, right? And he ended up like losing the person. So I said, I can't be part of this. I'm for the person, not objectifying them. Like, what good is that? Like, obviously he was in debate class and he'd learned all that mentality. And it's disgusting. So I separated from that group and went off. And instead I went and talked to these different people. And I asked them, like, how did you believe? How did you come to this position? Instead of, like we find in these debates, you're the enemy, I've got to crush you. So close-minded. So I learned to care about people, and it was actually Geisler who said, and I've often quoted this, and I learned a lot of good things from both Rabbi Zacharias and Norman Geisler, not to mention a lot of bad things, but nevertheless, Geisler said, if you're going to criticize something, first learn from them something. Or maybe I've changed it to say, maybe it's my own change of saying this, first learn something from the situation. Like, be in a state of learning. And then you'll be in the right attitude to critique the other person. But if you're not in that state, you're in there to teach, enforce, pound. The person's going to feel it and you've lost it. You've not done any good. You're just making them feel disgusted about you. And that's how I feel about this pressure that's being put upon people, especially Christians. severe sectarian judgmentalism. And so, and I will fully justify that in time here. But just read Romans 14 to get the cheat notes. So what's happening is I'm starting to realize more and more that the people that, again, coming to the same position where even the scholarship, the modern scholarship, these so-called authorities and experts, like for an example with Geisler, he wrote a book on the resurrection. And we in that organization analyzed it and found numerous examples of like false research and major mistakes, which then there was a volume 2 or a second edition, which added, I guess, the corrections. So I was involved in that at the time, and that's one of the biggest players, in apologetics. Later on, like 10 years down the road, I had a student of mine, and this is informal, that I was mentoring and teaching, and I introduced him to Geisler's writings and that, and he, not as to tell him to go off into that camp, if you will. I had my warnings and cautions, but he ended up going right to Geisler's school and becoming buddies with him. And so later on in life, I went to that school to a big meeting, a historical meeting where all the big guns were there, and greatly disappointed in what they said, in my opinion. But what happened was Geisler actually asked me to publish a book for him. I was like, whoa, what a opportunity and honor, right? I declined it because I did not want to have anything to do with him, really. I mean, I went to his class, he had a class there, and I gave him my books that I published. And after that, I never had any dealing with him. I had several others previous to that. But what I'm saying is, I've been around in these circles as a publisher of Christian classics. I was one of the first people to digitize books, and some of them went to the Master Christian Library, if you remember those ones. And so before really the internet as we know it, I was doing this scanning. That was my work, and republishing and running editorial information into these books, preserving. My policy is to be true to the original and not change the words of any author, like people are doing. Historical purity is very important to me, always has been. So I want to make that clear, that my whole life has been about historical purity. And now, what happened was, I don't want to forget what I want to say about my family and grandfather, because it has to do with history as well. And so I might as well dive into that. And it relates to what I'm going to say about so-called conspiracies. And it's easy for you in America here that are younger maybe, to say, how can you question anything? You should just believe everything you're told, right? Well, I am a historian of ancient history. Look at these. Josephus, primary evidence, very important. Fox's Book of Martyrs, quite interesting. And then, of course, apostolic fathers. Of course, these are not Simon Greenleaf's evidence. I don't have a copy of them. I have a digital copy. But I have many history books, but my life has been molded by history before my time. And I'm talking about family history. We have always known that on my father's side, descended from a noble, and who was not allowed to marry my great-great-grandmother. And that's always been a curiosity. And on my mother's side, my both grandparents descended from circuit riders of John Wesley. And I'm still waiting for my aunt she had told me the names before, but they were very well-known, circuit riders for John Wesley. And then also on that side, my great-grandfather supposedly survived the Titanic, which was a big thing for us children growing up. Oh wow, we're a survivor of the Titanic. So these stories in history sometimes are relevant to my own family. And so it's kind of exciting at times, it's kind of mysterious, and like my grandfather, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother had names that had 4 names in them, and they were all with that particular family, and even my name, my full name, it was named, I guess, after that. And so it's kind of a mystery. It doesn't mean too much to me, but now I want to get into something that does, because it did affect me at my growing up and my present, like, emotions, if you will. Because I don't want to look at things so merely academically that it's not in the real world. That's not me. And I'm sick of that dry, dead, unreal academics. That's not what you find with Jesus walking on the street, learning in the real world. So I'm approaching this in the real world context here, people, from a person who's been influenced by it and feels it. So what happened is, my grandfather, my father was born in Nazi Germany in 1940, and his earliest memories is being thrown into a baby carriage, running into a cave or whatever, and the bombs coming down. So I grew up with my father having nightmares, hearing him in the next room whimpering as a child, rehashing those and telling the stories and being ashamed of being German. And I grew up with a lot of German culture, but at least he still was ashamed in a lot of ways. And I didn't quite understand all that when I was really young. And then my grandfather, though, his father, had read through Mein Kampf and Hitler's book and saw what was going on and didn't agree with it. And he actually hid Jews and others in his home. And after the war, they were friends with Corrie ten Boom's family, too. Like close friends. And my grandfather was forced to build bridges and blow them up after the soldiers had crossed. He didn't have a choice. And then afterwards, or during that time, they wanted him to kill people and blow up towns with people in it, and he refused. And he survived, miraculously. He became a Christian halfway through the war. And then he also stopped a high-ranking officer from raping a Russian girl, and still wasn't killed. Ended up in a concentration camp in Russia at the end of the war, and came back and ended up building the Break Bible College in Germany. And Paschauer and those were the leaders. And my father went to Bible school there. Anyway, so I grew up with my dad saying certain things. If you repeat a lie over and over enough, people will believe it. That's what he said Hitler was saying, right? He always said that. He would always read his father's sayings and then talk to me about it, tell me things. And I knew my grandfather a little bit, but the point is, I grew up in that context of my family being stuck in a place where the prevailing news was propaganda, right? Where the science was to be believed, under any cost. The storyline, everything was to be believed, and you didn't dare question it, right? So when I hear anything like that, I say, sorry, it's not happening, right? I can really see that, right? So I want to set that stage by saying all that my family upbringing and the family history helps me look at this with a different perspective, as basically a survivor family. If you survived the Titanic, there's another side of it too. Whatever, the other one, the other grandfather, great-grandfather. So, so what I'm getting at is, eventually, I got more and more involved in, going back to my story now, more and more involved in participation in ministries. As a publisher, I talked to all sorts of people because I was doing all this old historical research, and when people would ask for information on that and buy these books, and quite an interesting opportunity to meet people, and I ended up being more and more in this country, so eventually, I left Canada. And it's funny because in my college papers that I did thesis on, one was ancient civilization, or modern Western civilizations, I should say. When I did ancient civilizations, I proved that the resurrection of Christ was a historical fact. And this was secular Canada, and people were quite upset. But I held my ground, and it was through works like this that you'll see, as we go over it, are very compelling as the ability to say proof. Not merely probable, but proof. Moral certainty is different than mathematical certainty. Remember that. That's going to be a major premise here. So, in my modern Western civilizations, I actually defended the American Revolution, not knowing that I would eventually come here. And so I sided with the Americans against the Loyalists. That wasn't too hard to do. Then, so I want to set the record straight. I am very pro-American historically. I do believe in, no matter how much hypocrisy might have been happening, I do believe in the Constitution. I do believe in the good that has happened. It seems like this country has done the greatest good and the worst evil of any country at the same time. It's hard to believe. It's hard to actually place. But I want to set that record straight. I am not anti-government. I am not. I'm not against schools or science. I'm all for that. But I'm more of I'm in the past. I'm a person, I'm going to argue from better days, is what I'm saying. My mentors are all dead. I had only one really good mentor who was my old boss, who was an old German guy who taught me quality over quantity. Besides that, there's been precious little good examples in our day to follow. So I went to fine schools. I did go to the University of Toronto a little bit. I went to Ontario Bible College for a course. I did various classes here and there. I've mastered several trades, which are different kinds of education. But academically, my studies are in real books from far superior minds than today, that exist today, that I'm aware of. Like Asa Mahan, the first president of Oberlin College, which was the first school to allow women and colored people to get a degree, and who risked their lives. His children were stoned in the streets of Cleveland. They survived, but they were stoned because he was the only preacher that allowed black people to even be inside of the church, to sit there. And that was like a southern city, Cleveland at the time, 1830s. So Oberlin College, I've done a lot of research pertaining to indirectly the slavery, Underground Railroad, and all the religious activity. There's so much in modern schools that come from that school and those people. There's probably 25 different major things that they contributed into this world that we are mostly thankful for. So that's my mentors, that's where I'm coming from, that's my education, and numerous other. And so when I come to this, I say that I value the information in these creationist books. I learn from them too. And I'm not against them personally. I'm disappointed for some of these decisions, and I want to be very clear of who I am and where I'm coming from. Because I don't want it to be, I would like to be a Christian matter. I tried to approach these people, talk to them. I tried to give the opportunity. I would go and meet them if I could, if they would want to. But now I'm taking the next step. And so, and I'm making it a learning opportunity for all of us. And so that's where I'm at with that. So what we want to look at here is we still are recording here, but it's going to stop. So I'm going to show you this right now. This is what we're after here. This is one of the main points I want to stress here. That disbelief is an active rejection of a proposition as false. Suspending, wait, I need to show this with light here. All right, suspending judgment is a cognitive process of withholding a conclusion or decision, waiting for more information before forming a belief. All right, so remember these things. There's a distinction between disbelief and suspending judgment. I'm going to hammer this over and over here. The key difference is that disbelief takes a definite stance against something, whereas suspending judgment takes a neutral stance, deliberately pausing the decision-making process. Right? Now, the fallacy that says you have only two choices, belief or disbelief, when a third option, such as suspension of belief, is available, is known as the faulty dilemma fallacy, or false dichotomy, or either-or fallacy. So remember that throughout this whole presentation, and I will be constantly referring to that. And so what I'm trying to do is address the nature of evidence, which that pertains to, of course, and I want to look positively and negatively at both the nature of the evidence for believing the evangelists, but not really, that's not my total goal, is to get you to come to some conclusion there, as much as looking at how he develops the argumentation to analyze them. Because we need to build that framework in order to analyze modern history in the same light. Because in this case, it's a golden opportunity for somebody to have said, and a whole organization, in fact, the other organization, the creationist organization, that split off from Answers in Genesis, says the same thing. Whereas Institute for Creation Research, I don't think makes that argument, hopefully not. Which is, again, to believe, never mind any other evidence, just believe the testimony of two Christians. And so it's a golden opportunity to show all the reasons that Simon Greenleaf gives to show that's a fallacy and insufficient, and you are not under any circumstances to accept such a testimony that you have no ability to cross-examine or examine the other primary evidence. So let's go into this quote here before this tape runs out here. Okay, so two different paragraphs here, and then I'll finish here. Every document apparently ancient, coming from the proper repository or custody, and bearing on its face no evident marks of forgery, the law presumes to be genuine, and devolves upon the opposing party the burden of proof to be otherwise. The burden of proof lies on him who impeaches its authority. In matters of fact, the rules of evidence require us to believe the testimony of credible witnesses unless impeached by circumstances which afford a reasonable ground of suspicion against their veracity, or unless their statements are contradicted by facts which, when we have certain knowledge, facts of which we have certain knowledge. Where neither of these occur, the mind is bound to receive their testimony as true. But where there arises such a suspicion or contradiction, we are bound either to disbelieve or to suspend our judgment according to the strength of the circumstances which create the doubt. So there's a lot of detail in the circumstances and the other primary evidence. But if you remove all the possibility of considering any primary evidence, or take away and exclude any contradictions, then of course you just have to accept the belief. So that they have a slam dunk argument because they've taken away all the rules. So again, let's go to the second paragraph. The rules of evidence by which human testimony is tried are few and simple, and of universal application. The credit due to the testimony of witnesses depends upon, first, their honesty, secondly, their ability, thirdly, their number, and the consistency of their testimony. Fourthly, the conformity of their testimony with experience. There's a point. Fifthly, coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. When these tests are satisfied, we are bound to believe their testimony unless it can be shown to be improbable, or unless facts exist which discredit it. And when neither improbability nor discrediting facts exist, to suspend judgment is unreasonable. So, essentially this is the point. Believe testimony when the witnesses are credible and no strong contradictory evidence or improbability exists. Disbelieve testimony when it is contradicted by certain knowledge or facts that make it incredible, not credible. Right? And then thirdly, suspend judgment only when doubt arises from suspicious circumstances, improbability, or unresolved contradictions strong enough to prevent certainty. Ta-da! So with that said, you can start thinking where you've done that. And for me, with the moon landing, I was put in that camp. Do I believe or disbelieve? And I realized that the suspension thing is very much more of a possibility for most people, because they don't have access to any primary evidence. They don't have the ability to cross-examine these so-called witnesses. Everything is basically classified. People are under orders. There's all sorts of conflicts that completely violate a solid reason to believe the testimony. And again, it's one thing to debate the subject when you count all the facts and you're allowed to consider everything presented. But when you say, like in this case, a very narrow sphere, the boundaries have changed. We're saying here that you must accept the testimony of two Christians, and that means that you Christians have to believe them, or you're calling them a liar. So therefore, whoa, what a serious matter. I don't want to call someone a liar. So, leaving it without just, I'm going to throw one element in there that will change this burden of proof. When you have one astronaut from the 1960s, Brian something or other, he was one of the astronauts in the 1960s who did say that he does not have 100% belief that they went to the moon. And he also said that they could have faked it, and they had motive to fake it. So those are major counter testimony that isn't easy to dismiss. So there is other testimony too that has to be weighed. And so what I want to do is set this foundation for properly evaluating what's proper to do with these limitations, the boundaries. So again, my books in my teaching in science is Advanced Electrodynamics, in which I am showing higher end technology that is within industry, that is, and I show and I demonstrate patents that do extraordinary things. we make battery chargers that allow you to keep your batteries instead of having to replace them and restore useless batteries. I do, and I research, I get into things that are very exotic, let's just say. It's not getting into occultic things. It's not getting into fascination with things. So I want to deal with the personality that's the caricature of the so-called conspiracy theorist. And I want to explain, because I deal with a lot of people that are lost and bound in that bondage, and that, you know, it's a very important thing for us to look at. And I don't want to be called that. I don't deserve to be called that. I'm a counselor. I help a lot of people come out of that. But I don't do it like what some of these people are doing, by pounding them, by basically calling them a heretic that needs to be exterminated. We don't want this inquisitor. That only makes more people like that. So that's my appeal. If you want to hear these subjects, I'm going to dive into them, Lord willing. I already have it all written out, and it's just a matter of the delivery now and the time to do it. So I'm calling for reconciliation. I'm calling for peace. I'm calling for sound judgment. You know, I'm calling for every verse of the scripture screaming at you about the subject. Let's dive into this. It pertains to so many subjects. It's exhaustive. It's exhausting to consider. And like I said, for those of you who are condemning so-called conspiracies, we've done the calculation. Over 60% of the Bible itself is narrating conspiracy in the context of a conspiracy and teaching on the subject, warning against doing that, the prophecy unfolding. So to say that it's not something we should focus on, we shouldn't get overwhelmed with, yes, but it's anti-biblical, and it's ridiculous, the argumentation along those lines, which I'm going to have a whole video on that subject, showing that we are in a battle. We are, and we must deal with it, and deal with it with the right spirit and so forth. So, thanks for watching, and I hope you can join me on this adventurous process. I'd like to learn from everybody too, as much as I can.